Hello, friends. The following is a conversation with Steve James. Steve James is host of the Guru Viking podcast. He is someone that likes to explore the human experience, the journey, spirituality, enlightenment, and he is a cool person to talk to. In this episode, we dove deep into his journey on how he became the Guru Viking, his interest in spirituality, and into enlightenment and what it's not. Enjoy the episode. Also, guys, be sure that you are subscribed, that you like, that you leave comments. What got you intrigued? What was your favorite part of the episode? I'm very curious to hear from you, and leaving reviews, liking, subscribing, and sharing goes a really long way to support this podcast. So, guys, if you enjoy this content and want to see more of it, it would really help me out to spread the word. Thank you so much. I found your content shortly after I did an interview with Dr. Justin Sledge, and I was also watching Viking Valhalla. So as soon as I saw Guru Viking, I was like, oh, I have to check this guy out. What's the story behind Guru Viking?
I suppose it's why many podcasts start, really. I had many friends who I was having interesting conversations with, and I wanted to do something with that. I felt there was some really cool things that my friends were saying, and I wanted to record that somehow and capture that. That was one of the impetuses. So I thought, why not interview them and start to bring some of that out? Another one is I'm a relentlessly curious person. I love asking questions and researching things and things like that. And I'm quite a creative person, so I like to create things. I like to make things. Of course, in this sort of a field, you can make things by you being the one doing all the talking. You know, some podcasts are like that. It's a sort of sermon of the week from Gabby and Steve or whatever. But I don't find myself sufficiently interesting to sustain that. So it was an excuse basically to be creative and curious and get to know people and research new topics and this sort of thing. So that's really why it's an interview format for that reason.
Right.
I find people very interesting indeed, especially in the field of religion, spirituality, beliefs, practices of various types, and including the slightly more intellectual outcroppings of that, academic things as well. So that's why I started it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think I see a lot of resemblance in that in myself as well. But I'm curious, like, why the name Guru Viking? How did that come about?
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, you need a name for a podcast, right? So I couldn't just call it the Steve podcast. And I thought, well, what a name. Of course, I'm not a guru or a Viking. But the podcast is about, as I mentioned before, religion, spirituality, etc., that whole thing. And so hence the guru part. And I'm interested in meditation and I like to practice it and investigate these sorts of things. And as for the Viking part, well, I come from the Shetland Islands. I have a long red beard. I live on a boat. So hence Guru Viking.
Can you actually talk to me about living on a boat? How did that happen?
Well, I live on a boat, and we have these things in the UK called narrow boats or canal boats. Throughout the UK, before we had railways and things like that, we built this, or dug really, this arterial system of canals, man-made rivers throughout the country. And on those man-made rivers, the canals, we had these barges, 6'10" wide, and however long, my one is 57 foot long. And we'd put stuff on them, you know, logs and coal and stuff or whatever. And it would be pulled along the towpath, attached to a pony, pulled along the towpath. And they're actually, despite the fact that it's a very huge, heavy boat, you can pull it along. Even as a human being, you can pull it along. Quite reasonably when it gets going in the water, of course. And so that was how we transported goods, heavy goods, etc., around the UK through this arterial system of man-made rivers, these canals. And nowadays, of course, we don't transport things that way, but people live on them. And so I live on a boat, which is a sort of houseboat, really. And sometimes I keep it in one place. Sometimes I move it throughout the canal system. And that's the story.
So my heart's a little bit broken that you don't identify as a guru or a Viking.
Sorry, we can cancel if you wish. False pretenses.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so can you talk to me about some of the things that you've learned about religion and, maybe some of the more memorable guests that you've had that have just maybe blown your mind or taught you something new?
Gosh, I'm sure you can relate to this. All of my guests teach me something new.
Mm.
And whether it's about content, of course, a lot of my guests are real experts in the field. You mentioned Dr. Justin Sledge, who I've also interviewed a couple of times, and he's a good example, actually, of someone, a real expert. But to take him as an example, seeing as you've interviewed him too, also an inspirational kind of person, not just the content, but his sort of something about his attitude and his message, which is a kind of can-do attitude. You can do it if you work hard. He talks about learning various different ancient languages and so on, for example, or treating academia, which is his field, as work. Like going to work, fitting pipes, which I think is what he did with his father. And that is very sort of inspirational in a way. There's something inspirational about him and a bit iconoclastic about him too. And he's a very generous person, at least in my experience of him, with his time and his knowledge. So that also, I think, is a sort of teaching in a way. Aside from the content that my guests might produce about their various different faith systems or whatever it is that they're interested in, their practices and so on, or their personal experiences of those systems, very often the thing that I'm left with most impressed by is this sort of level of inspiration or teaching from who they are as people.
It's interesting, and it makes me curious, though, about your religious journey and about what you're hoping to learn from your guests. If there is something specific, I know you are a curious person. What was your religious journey that makes you now fascinated about religion and spirituality?
Yeah, there's two interesting questions there. My own sort of journey and what I might hope to learn. If there's some sort of personal quest
Right.
for my own personal religious side going on in these interviews.
Yeah.
To the second one, I would say, perhaps I'll start there because it's quicker. I would say, no, not really. I don't really find myself to be much of a spiritual seeker.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeking enlightenment or union with God or salvation or anything like that. Probably I should be. I should be seeking all three of those, but I don't really. And so for whatever reason. So I'm not looking for the guest to give me the key to the next step for me personally in my own sort of journey per se. I wouldn't say that's really what it's about. It's intrinsically satisfying to me to have these conversations and get to know the people and learn about their lives and share their experiences through the hearing of their stories. That to me it's sort of intrinsically satisfying. It's the reward in itself. There are other podcasts that take a different approach. There are podcasts, I think they can be very powerful actually. There are people who are seeking and they interview people to try to answer their own deep questions. Or there are podcasts run by people who consider themselves to be, gurus, maybe not Vikings, but gurus. And then it's a sort of talk between peers on, fellow mystics or fellow enlightened ones. But I don't really see myself in any of those categories. So for me, it's intrinsically satisfying somehow to talk to people in these podcasts. And as for my own religious journey, well, briefly speaking, when I was a little boy, I had two main influences in that regard. The first was I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church on the Shetland Islands, as I mentioned. And I loved that very much. And my mother had a particular idea about religion, Catholicism, you could say. And that idea is that one can approach it as a private faith, as there's different ways of engaging with religion. And she didn't see it as a gathering together in a place to celebrate all believing the same thing. We all believe this, we all believe that. Isn't it great that we all believe the same thing? She didn't really see it like that. She saw it as a place where you could go personally, of course, within a community, within a ritual space. But fundamentally, it was a sort of personal orientation, a personal contemplative orientation. A quiet faith, you could say, a private faith, personal faith. And so she didn't send my brother and I to a catechism, which is the sort of, they send the kids off during the Mass, the ritual, or sometimes afterwards, and then a volunteer will teach them the tenets of the faith. She didn't believe in that kind of thing. She said that the sort of person who wants to teach catechism should probably not be allowed to teach catechism. That's that old joke about politicians, anyone who wants to be a politician should immediately be disqualified from doing so. The idea, of course, that the virtuous leader is the reluctant one. It's an old idea. But anyway, maybe the virtuous catechist is a reluctant catechist. Probably that's true, actually.
Mm.
So we didn't get a lot of the doctrinal side of it. Mainly what we got was our participation in ritual. And it was the early morning mass. So that meant no singing, no guitars, no tambourines, no pyrotechnics or whatever. And so as an altar boy, you just participate in the ritual. If you've never seen what that looks like, the priest is doing this sort of predetermined ritual with various different actions, and the altar boy, by myself or with my brother, you sort of help out, but it's choreographed. So you got to carry a candle over here, carry it over there. You ring a little bell at certain times. You bring a chalice, or you take the chalice away. You do various things. So it's a sort of a choreographed ritual participation that you do as an altar boy, and you wear an outfit and stuff. And in between those moments of engagement, we would sit behind the priest facing in like that. So as I look at you now, if I'm the priest, then the audience, the congregation is in front of me, and then behind me is the altar. And then either side behind there are these two benches, and the altar boys sit there. So it's a ritual participation interspersed with periods of silent sitting. And I found that to be extremely powerful, wonderful, and profound, actually. Although, once again, no real doctrinal framework behind it, which is kind of strange, I think. It's a bit unusual, but wonderful. And I'm so glad for that openness that allowed me.
Mm-hmm.
And the other influence was martial arts. Around that same age, about 5 years old, which is when I started being an altar boy and started doing this sort of thing. Around that same age, I started doing martial arts training. And that's also a kind of, has a sort of aspect of, I don't know, it's related somehow. I fell in love with it. I loved the movements. I love when we'd stand there and hold the arm out for a few minutes, maybe probably a minute, but it felt like such a long time when you're a little kid, I loved I immediately understood the mind-body training, or the mind-body, how it reveals things about the way your mind and body work. And that embodied aspect of it, I really enjoyed. I enjoyed the rigor and the aggression and the energy of it, as well as the form and the restraint and the discipline. And we would sit and meditate in that class. Often we'd spar, we'd do at the end just like training, fighting and stuff, very light. But it's really knackering. If you've ever tried to spar, it's really tiring. And, you're huffing and puffing, and then suddenly we'd stop and have to kneel on the hard wooden floor, and the knees are sore and the breath is heaving, and we do breath control exercises. And we'd learn to feel the oxygen debt, feel that sense of the desperation to breathe, but control the breathing, kind of simmer in that sense of wanting to breathe, but not giving in to that, And then we'd sit silently there. Sort of interesting relationship between suffering and discipline and peace and stuff, freedom. So that aspect too. And I really loved it. And as a consequence of that, I read lots of things. So you can't read much about martial arts. Karate, of course, is Japanese, so you can't read much about that before you start to learn about Japanese culture and religion. And then you must, of course, you end up in China, then you end up more broadly, India, the world, ancient Greece, whatever, Persia, you go the whole way. So I started reading there all about yogas and different things like that, and practicing them and trying them out. Initially from books, although I knew the religions are, of course, different. I didn't feel that, didn't feel inhibited to explore them with whatever means I had available, which is mostly books in those days. We didn't really have like podcasts or YouTube or anything like that. It's just books. That was really great. And I've really continued like that ever since. So as to whether or not, I don't know whether those things gave me that interest or whether I had that sort of an orientation and was caught early enough in some very positive influences that allowed that to flourish. So nature or nurture, I don't know which it is. Probably some kind of combination. I don't know. Probably a little bit of nature, for sure. And I've just continued that exploration. So it's really that same animating force is in me today, that tremendous curiosity and enjoyment of all the different sorts of religions and things.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Wow. So, meaning from the martial arts plus your combination of enjoying the practice of doing something within faith, you go on this philosophical journey trying to understand these different cultures in the Far East and making your way to India. So what's that? I'm so curious to understand what you were learning, like what you were discovering at that time. What were those steps and those epiphanies that you were having that perhaps aligned with your journey?
Well, gosh, I mean, I was reading lots of books about um, history, legend, religion, practice, application, and just found it to me immediately interesting and very tangible.
Hmm.
Didn't seem, of course, it's a faraway place in faraway times, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, thousands of miles away, etc. But I think especially in young boy's enthusiastic mind, these things can seem very vivid, very tangible and exciting. I'm sure you've had that experience reading where it's almost like you're there. You feel that
Yeah.
feeling. So I
Yeah.
was reading all about those things and trying those things. So I was trying different sorts of practices that I could find and, experimenting with them and learning about the way different people have thought about life and
Hmm.
that sort of thing. I didn't feel a particular need to ascribe to anyone. I wasn't looking for the answer necessarily. I think I was just really interested in it all. And
Hmm.
so I don't know why in my mind it doesn't seem to need to be an exclusive allegiance to a particular way of thinking. I seem to be able to have a few different perspectives, I suppose, going on at the same time. Maybe that is a perspective in itself.
I think Carl Jung said that if the way in front of you is clear, then you're on somebody else's path.
Aha, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. I really admire the fact that there wasn't any specific alliance to one way of thinking. Like you were kind of just open and experiencing all of it and being inspired by all of it. But I'm just wondering at the same time, were there any maybe more pivotal books that you can maybe recommend as places that you started or just things that had blown your mind?
Yeah. Where I started. So this is not, by the way, a reading list recommendation because the problem with that is if I had to think about that, I'd have, because the problem is sometimes where you start, I will give you something though of where I started, but sometimes where you start isn't the best place to start.
Mhm.
There's not the place you recommend someone else to start.
Right.
And sometimes I think if you want to learn, you can learn from almost any source, regardless of its quality. And over time, you develop a sensitivity to better or worse sources. At first, you just read whatever you can get your hands on, and you're not really in a position to discriminate based, quality or whatever. And then over time, you can get a bit better. So I was quite voracious and read lots and lots of things. But I can think of a few books that were very exciting. Or one of the first books that opened up this sort of international perspective was The Asian Fighting Arts. I think it's called something like that by Don F. Drager. That's a really classic book. Martial artists will know that one. And that one tells a lot of stories and describes different sorts of martial arts and the cultures and histories of them. And that was really interesting. And the religions and myths and legends that go along with them. But also the Tao of Jeet Kune Do by Bruce Lee was really influential, actually. As were lots of books by or about Bruce Lee. There were some of his practice journals were published too, which I followed very closely. The Tao of Jeet Kune Do was so influential, I wrote the entire thing out by hand, in fact, including its diagrams. It's sort of Bruce Lee's philosophy of martial arts, you could say, something like that. And so it has a lot of life aspects to it as well. And I found that very, very potent, very pragmatic, and very, very powerful. Those are a couple of books. Gosh, I could go on and on. There were so many. I
Um,
mean, we could do the whole podcast. Could just be me talking about books if you'd like. I'm sure.
No, that's fine. But I'm a big fan of books, so I like hearing what other books were influential for other people's lives, and it's always just such an insight into, I think, like the like personal philosophies and ways of thinking, and I admire it because I feel like a book as opposed to a podcast is a very thought out. Somebody is taking the time to really put down their wisdom into words and writing, and there's a certain level of intent when it comes to putting word to page as opposed to speaking it out. And, a podcast is fascinating for the reason that we could just have this conversation and it's flowing and it's interesting and it doesn't have to be so thought out and challenge your thinking in such a deep way. It could be more like casual. Of course, it can be deep as well. But books are so great that it's like, how are you challenging yourself to really think about somebody else's perspective? That's how I see it.
Actually, I remembered 2 or 3 other books.
Okay, good. Yeah,
Well, you're a book lover too, so it's just so infectious,
yeah.
isn't it?
All
That
right.
kind of enthusiasm. A couple of other ones that were really, really good. Gorin no Sho, The Book of Five Rings, Miyamoto Musashi. The Art of War, Sun Tzu, that I found to be very, very powerful. And also the Bible, of course. I cannot ignore that. And for a long time, years actually, I would read, Proverbs has, I think, 30 chapters, 31 chapters. I forget now which one it is, Book of Proverbs. And so I would read a chapter a day of that. So that would take each month, basically going through the Book of Proverbs and a couple of Psalms, 1 or 2 Psalms maybe each day also. And then usually some kind of New Testament reading, just working my way through it, for example, and then same with the an Old Testament track, working my way through that too. So getting a bit of that. But so I sort of moved through the Old New Testaments in parallel or concurrently like that, but also repeat the Proverbs and cycle every month, daily reading every month, and then sort of get to the Psalms in a sort of, I suppose, a larger cycle than a monthly cycle because there's more of them. But,
Interesting.
So those are some other things that come to me as you're seeing as you've tickled my book memories.
Why do you cyclically read the Old and New Testament?
You mean why both at the same time, or why keep going over them again and again?
Yeah, and Proverbs and all that. Are you learning something new each time? Like, what is that practice for you?
Yes. Well, one of the big themes of the Book of Proverbs is how important wisdom is, and how good an idea it is to soak in wisdom.
Hmm.
I'm not suggesting that the Book of Proverbs is the only or premier wisdom source by any stretch, but it does have a lot to say about wisdom. And it has a lot to say about openness to wisdom and receptivity to wisdom. And that it's a virtue to sort of expose yourself to wisdom and hang around that wisdom and to let it seep into you. And you just go over it again and again, and it gets deeper into you. And, I think wisdom literature in general is to be contemplated as well as read. You mean you read it like you read Harry Potter or War and Peace, but you can also read it repeatedly, and it hits you different each time. You're in a different state of mind. If you're reading the same thing, say in a cyclical way, it hits you in a different state. Regular practice in general has that quality. If you practice regularly, some people practice when they feel like practicing, say meditation or prayer or reading scripture or whatever. They do it when they feel like it. And that's great to do that, actually, when the inspiration strikes. But if you practice regularly, then you end up practicing even when you don't feel like it. Or you end up practicing at the very least in all sorts of different states, not just the sort of practicey state that makes you want to practice. And so then it's like having a job that is outside. If you have a job working outside, then you end up working outside in all kind of weathers. And it's the same, I think, with practices. If you do them regularly, then you end up doing it in all kinds of different weather, but internal weather and the circumstances of your life. So reading those kind of books like Proverbs on a monthly cycle like that, you're encountering the text always in a different place. And the words are the same, but you're never the same. Your world isn't the same. Your mind isn't the same. So there's always that kind of freshness to it. And just the sheer repetition of it starts to seep in. It starts to become part of your operating system, these guiding principles of wisdom. I'm not suggesting it's the premier or the best or the only. There's so much great wisdom literature in the world, but I enjoyed them and I read them in that kind of a way. Yeah.
Interesting. Do you have advice for creating a discipline around either reading, or it could be anything really?
Yeah, a few things. One of them is to, well, actually, really, the first thing is to clarify why it is you want to do it. That's really important because sometimes we're attracted to certain things, and the reason's relatively superficial. Wouldn't it be cool to learn, Spanish, right? Or wouldn't it be cool to, do this or that? And really, it's sort of a superficial thing. Like you hinted at before, maybe something you've picked up, you've seen an advert or heard something in a movie or whatever, and you'd like to have a bit of that. But if it doesn't go a bit deeper than that, it can be hard to stick to something. So it's about finding a why that's sufficiently motivating, and there are different ways to do it. One of the great ways that I first heard from somebody called Tony Robbins, believe it or not. I read this in a Tony Robbins book when I was like 17 or something. And he suggested to make 3 lists of 10 items. The first list of 10 items is you imagine yourself 10 years in the future, and you imagine all the good things that will be a consequence of you having done this. So let's take reading as an example, let's just take reading as an example. So, well, the first thing I applied this to actually was learning to read music, which is a sort of like a different language in a way. So you imagine 10 years in the future, what it would be like if you'd practice that and you'd done it. And I would imagine all the opportunities that it would open up and all, this sort of thing. And you really try to imagine 10 things that are emotionally resonant. It doesn't have to be logical, it mainly has to be emotionally evocative. And then you make another list, 10 negative consequences of not doing it. And then I would imagine myself in 10 years' time unable to do that thing, and really try to imagine the lost opportunities, the embarrassing situations that I'd be in, unable to do that thing. Musician's context, of course, that's an important skill. And then, but with reading, it could be, you have to come up with your own. And then the third column is 10 reasons why you can do it. And for example, for reading, one of them is reading music. One of them is that, little kids can read music. There are little kids who can read music really well. And I'm a grown up. And so it can be done. Other people have done it, so I can do it. I've done other things that are hard. So you try to make these kind of arguments, 10 emotionally resonant arguments as to why it's possible for you. That's a great way of aligning one's, sort of getting one's motivation. It's not finding a why, it's like excavating emotionally resonant, motivating towards and away from motivation, towards the good stuff, and perhaps more crucially, away from the bad stuff, the things you don't want to happen. So leveraging these things, that can be quite helpful. And if you can't come up with anything at that stage, then you could do it again, I suppose, or you might ask yourself, is this really, do I really want to do this? Or what is underneath my desire to do this? Is there something I'm seeking with the idea of this, learning this thing or establishing this practice? There's something I'm trying to do here that's not really the thing. That's just a placeholder. And you might get a layer deeper and think, actually, no, I feel insignificant, or I feel something, I feel out of control, or I feel inadequate, or I feel whatever, right? I feel ambitious or something. And then you can ask yourself, what other ways might you fulfill those deeper drives? And so then you end up maybe not learning Rosetta Stone Spanish, but pursuing some other kind of path that's more finely tuned. So I have lots and lots of thoughts about how to establish and maintain a regular practice, but that's a sort of pre-step to even doing it, I suppose.
I'd like to encourage the listeners to take something in their life right now that they're trying to implement and do what Dr. Guru Viking has just prescribed for us. But yeah, no, that's a beautiful piece of advice. And it's funny, I've used that advice for myself before. I saw it on a YouTube video, and it was massively helpful in creating change.
Yeah, it is really, really good. Yeah. Likewise, I found it very helpful, especially when also with procrastination, with a sort of inertia, even in an existing project, something you're already doing, maybe something you're already quite competent at, and you need to refresh, refocus. Then I sometimes touch this exercise and get my head straight again about what it is I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And that can often clear the decks for doing more work.
Can you talk to me a bit about this interest in Bruce Lee and what that was like? Did you grow up with him? Can you talk to me about that a little bit?
Well, I think little boys often have heroes, right? I had a few heroes, and he was one of them. What did I like? What did I like about him? Well, it wasn't so much his movie persona precisely. It wasn't that I saw him in Enter the Dragon and thought, That's so. I mean, actually, I did. I saw him in Enter the Dragon and all those movies, and I thought they looked so cool and it's so great. And I was into martial arts, and he's sort of the fame. He's the martial artist, really, isn't he? And
Mm.
the most famous, right? I would say, probably culturally speaking. But it turned out beneath that cool movie star martial artist layer, he was quite an interesting guy. He trained a lot, relentlessly training, always working out new ways of training and applying himself and practicing and exercising, which I was very into as well. Exercising and just train. I love the discipline. I love to just go into the garage and just exercise and train and work on things. It was, and I still do. I love that. I love to apply myself to things, especially things of a practice nature, of a sort of solo nature. Going away and like into the alchemy lab, and I'm not a real alchemy lab. That's a metaphor, by the way. I'm not an alchemist. I'm not a guru. I'm not a Viking, and I'm not an alchemist. It's a metaphor.
Heartbreak upon heartbreak over here.
I know. Just one of many beginning of a series of terrible disappointments, Gabby, when you get them more. But so I love that, and it really lined up with that enormous passion and fire that I had for training. And he had a lot of interesting philosophical ideas, and he was really questioning things too. He questioned the traditional arrangement of martial arts, and his martial art philosophy that he came up with, this Jeet Kune Do philosophy. He had this sense of absorbing what is useful, to quote one of the great maxims of their system: absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is essentially your own. So this is sort of pragmatic approach that I found quite amazing. And it was often met with resistance, and it was objected to by certain traditional martial arts systems, people in those systems who were very loyal to their own particular way of doing things and valued tradition, which of course is important. I also value tradition a great deal. And so did Bruce Lee, I think. But nonetheless, in one's own journey as a martial artist, emphasis on the art part of it, in which one's life, one's expression, one's practice becomes a sort of artistic process. There is a kind of freedom, an element of freedom that has to be brought in alongside the strict rigor of tradition. This combination of those things on the personal artistic level is very important. So he had ideas like that, which were very interesting. And he had interesting phrases like his whole monologue about being like water, this ability to adjust to situations and circumstances that you find yourself in, to not be rigid, to be able to be a different sort of person or a different shape of person in different situations, and not to become fixed or ossified. That I found very appealing. So there are lots of things. So I think, beneath his cool Enter the Dragon exterior, there was a wonderful engagement with the martial arts, training, hard work, ambition, striving. He was also an international person, coming to America and making his way, from nothing, etc. Really, really great. Tremendous intellect and intellectual and philosophical strand to him too, which I found resonated with me a great deal at that time. There's a bit more about Bruce Lee.
This is fascinating. I'm like, he was such an icon, and he was before my time. So it's interesting to see what other people were so mesmerized by.
Yes, he was dead by the time I was interested in him too. Probably by the time I was born, he was dead. I'm not exactly sure when he died, but pretty sure. But his books and his films and his training journals and his legend, you could say, lived on.
Yeah. Can you talk to me? You've developed your own movement as well. Can you talk to me about that? And I'm curious and fascinated by it.
Sure, it's called Movement Koan Method, and it's it's a combination of joint nourishing movement and what it says in the DVDs anyway, body-based mindfulness. Yeah. So it's got these two aspects, movement and koan. For the movement side, it's joint nourishing, movements of various types, also movements that train strength, coordination, dexterity, movements involving limb independence, crossing the body in various different ways to stimulate mind-body connection and different ways of thinking, etc. So there's this whole aspect of movement in that sense. And then the koan part, Koan, that's a Japanese word coming from the Zen tradition. And in Zen, particularly Rinzai Zen, they have this koan system. And it's, to put it rather in a broad sense, there are a series of sort of training questions or riddles in a sense. They're not exactly riddles, but they're sort of like that, that your teacher asks you, and then you go away and sort of work on the koan, you sort of contemplate them. And of course, the goal is to find an answer, and then you come back to the teacher and you present your answer, and you either pass the koan or not. So that, on one level, that's the goal. But on another level, the process of contemplation of this koan is itself a sort of portal of practice. That's also what's going on, a way of learning. So it's a sort of portal, if you like, of inquiring to a spiritual way. And when I say movement koan, the movements that we use are a kind of portal for inquiry, a portal for investigation. So I set them up. There are 2 DVD downloads, Movement Koan 1 and 2. They're numbered because there's 2 of them. And I set them up in such a way that when you're doing the movements, there's a possibility for an inquiry of a deeper nature. For example, we have one particular exercise where you stand on one leg and you sort of swing the other one back and forth. Not very high, you just swing it back and forth. And you relax as much as you can the base leg, the one that's on the ground, while still maintaining your posture. So you need a certain amount of muscular activation on that base leg and foot in order to stay standing. But the koan is, how much can you relax, or how little muscular tension do you need, and still maintain your standing position? Minimum necessary muscular activation. And so what people find there, so that's the setup, if you like. And what people find there, a few things they might find, and I sort of might point some of these things out or hint at them. One of them is that, your leg starts to get tired. And the more you relax the leg, sometimes as you relax that leg, the feeling of the fatigue spikes. You feel more. Because we don't only use tension for the purpose that it's ostensibly for, which in this case is standing on one foot. We also use it for other things too. One of those things is as an anesthesia, a kind of bracing against feeling. When you get a shot at the doctor, right, people tense up, right, bracing against feeling. And so we use tension. So tension can be a kind of block to feeling. And so when you disambiguate the use, the tension that you need for standing from the tension that you need for bracing, you can realize that there's at least 2 things going on here, but maybe more. And of course, using muscular tension to anesthetize the product of muscular tension, which is muscular fatigue, is not a very smart long-term strategy. But we do it. And so one of the secrets to endurance and to skill in general is this refining of effort. Actually, to be more relaxed, funnily enough. But the price that you pay for that is you'll feel more. Another thing we use tension for is a kind of anticipation of future balancing needs. There might be a sense of, you're standing on one leg and you're swinging the other one, and you might think to yourself, well, I don't know how long I'm going to be here. How long are we going to balance? What, maybe across a whole minute or more. What if I have future balance? So you tense in anticipation of future balancing needs in case you need to make an adjustment. But you don't need to balance over time. You can't balance over time. You can only balance now. If you're balanced now, you'll be balanced now. You can't balance now and in the future. You can't balance now and in the past. But we cast forward into the future and we cast back into the past. And we sort of brace in this sort of physical sense in relationship to those things. And what does that do? Well, in the case of the exercise, it burns energy. It inhibits the possibility of what you can do in response to what's happening now. And I perhaps don't need to point out that this is a physical way of exploring certain principles that are applicable in other domains. For example, in your professional life, in learning ventures, in interpersonal relationships. Sometimes the tension, the effort, the energy we're putting in, it's not just that There's other things bundled in with that energy, other uses that we use. So we disambiguate in the leg the uses of tension. What do you need for standing? And what do you need for the other things? And what happens if you let those things go? So that if you get that in the body, if you learn those sorts of principles or explore them in the body where it's very tangible, where it's very tractable, then it's easier, I think, with that somatic reference point, to apply it to all kind of situations, whether it's interpersonal, professional, learning, whatever is the case. This is that standing on a leg thing. This is that koan of minimum necessary muscular activation. So this is some of what that is behind the sort of the ideas, if you like, behind the Movement Koan Method.
It's such a brilliant concept, and it reminds me of as you're talking about tension physically being a way to distract from feeling, anxiety, which is like mental tension, is it's making me wonder, what are we hiding behind when we feel anxiety? What are we afraid of? And one of the reasons that meditation is so helpful for helping people with anxiety is that when you're able to sit with whatever it is that is bothering you, and you're not having that resistance, you're able to relax into it, and you recognize, like, oh, I could relax. This isn't so bad. This isn't as overwhelming. And somebody would come to that realization on their own. And it's fascinating and it's beautiful. And I love that you found a way to do this physically. How did you come up with that idea to be able to do that?
How did I come up with it? Well, looking for ways to set up learning situations for people around those sorts of themes. And also, that's basically it. So drawing together my various influences, which I've already described to you, and trying to set up a learning situation. So rather than imposing answers on people, rather attempting to set up an inquiry-based approach, you could say, whereby people can discover and learn for themselves.
Interesting.
So, the inspiration for that sort of thing comes, I think, to quote Bruce Lee maybe before, you sort of absorb what's useful, you reject what's useless, and you add what is essentially your own. It's a sort of creative process. That's basically how it comes to be. But, about this idea of tension and feeling, of course, there are a few reasons why people don't feel, because people often, they talk about embodiment, right? And I define as embodiment as feeling what's there to be felt. I don't define myself embodiment as feeling a particular way, like feeling whole or feeling integrated or feeling in touch with the body. Because to me, that if you limit your definition of an embodiment to only positive states, then you exclude other states, negative states that say, sometimes you don't feel at home in the body. Sometimes you feel alienated from your body. That's what you're feeling. Sometimes you feel fragmented. Sometimes you feel unsafe, right? Whatever the case may be, uncomfortable, right? And so if you limit your definition of embodiment to only positive states of wholeness, integration, etc., then you exclude all those negative ones. And the problem with embodiment, which is feeling what's there to be felt, is that you don't know what you're going to feel until you feel it. So it could be anything, could be any kind of experience you have. And so I think, of course, it's natural to wish to aim for states of wholeness and, satisfaction and positive states. It's natural to do that. It's the momentum of the organism to optimize its conditions. But that's a second step. That's a sort of response step. The first step of contact, I think, can't be limited to a bias for positive states, because that's not always what you're going to find. But anyway, so some people, they want to get more embodied, and other people are very interested in embodiment, helping people get in touch with their feelings and become kind of crusaders for that, or evangelists for that. But there are lots of reasons why people don't feel. Sometimes it's because habitual tension, just throughout the day, habitual tension and stress doesn't go much deeper than that. And when you're able to shed that, people are able to connect once again with, themselves, right? Other times, it can be something deeper. One of the reasons people don't feel is because it hurts down there. Some people, when they get in touch with what they're feeling or where their body feels or their emotions or even their mind, it's tumultuous, painful, perhaps, stress, traumas, etc. under there. And so I think sometimes embodiment people, or get in touch with your feeling kind of people, professionals of all types, who do that in the name of, let's say, embodiment, right? Thrust people through that liminal barrier between where they are, what they're conscious of, and what's underneath. It's good for you. Feel your feelings, feel your body, get in touch, relax the barriers, open the Pandora's box in the name, because it's good for you, right?
Yeah.
Because maybe it was good for them, or because they haven't thought very deeply, or they don't have much experience with people, and they've got an idea, but not much application. And it can, I think, be kind of re-traumatizing sometimes and not so smart. So the other aspect of an inquiry-based approach is that you set up a field of inquiry, a field of exploration that people can edge into at different levels of capacity. And as they become more comfortable, confident, and competent navigating those kinds of waters, the waters of their own experience, they're able to open up more and go deeper at their own rate, rather than a kind of insistence that they feel and so on. And that's a problem with meditation, that a lot of times in meditation, the idea is that we just need to feel more. It'll be okay. Once you get used to it, it'll be fine. Just do a bit more meditation and you'll be fine. Keep going. I feel like, I'm freaking out. Say, yeah, it's fine. Keep breathing. Focus on your breathing. This is part of the process. Your chakras are clearing. Your channels are emptying. Your patterns are unraveling. Your attentions are dissolving. Your traumas are releasing, etc. Sometimes the answer is not more. Sometimes those defenses are there for a reason. Those defenses against feeling. I think they should be honored and respected. However, when one gets locked into them, then sometimes it could be nice to have some help to open up. And sometimes you can do something like that with meditation or Movement Koan Method. Other times you need, as you well know, being a therapist yourself, you need a therapist, a trauma therapist or something like that. Some kind of more focused professional attention on what it is that is uncovered. So that, I think, is becoming more and more known in the world of meditation, for example, that there are limits to what meditation can do. And sometimes one has to refer out to a specialist, say a trauma therapist or some other kind of therapist, when something comes up that's outside of the scope of one's meditation practice, or indeed of the method itself.
You're putting a lot of things together for me that I haven't necessarily connected before. I do want to talk about spirituality and healing in today's world. And I think, as you were beginning to describe your method, I think you mentioned that there's like a inquiries towards spirituality as well, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. And I think also about the deep dive that you were talking about. A lot of people will just say like, "Oh, go all in, and it's okay, and keep going." I think one of the dangers of psychedelics is exactly that problem, where it's too much too fast, and if somebody's not ready for it, it could be a really dangerous, harmful experience psychologically. If you are ready, even then, it could sometimes just be completely out of our control, and that could be very scary. But yeah, it could also be a powerful healing tool, under the right circumstances. But yeah, I want to just talk to you about modern spirituality.
Gosh, anything in particular that is
Yeah,
in your mind there?
I don't, sometimes I don't like to ask very direct questions because I like to hear where my guest is going to go. But yeah, just for starting, what do you think is like the state of the spirituality in Western world compared to, you grew up in England, very Western culture, and then you were reading these other materials from the East. I'm curious to hear if you have some type of reflection on the spiritual state versus the things that you were reading in other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, on that little Scottish island of Shetland, yes, I was reading things from the East and the West, actually, and from all different sorts of time periods too, and told and written from all different perspectives. If you read a document that's written by, I don't know, let's say, one example is, you can read a contemporary historical account of something written by someone at the time. For example, Pliny the Younger writes, I was just in Naples And that's where the big, volcano
Mm.
erupted all those centuries and centuries ago. And in Pompeii, which is right next to Naples, it turns out that I can read a book about that now, and that's really cool, or hear a guide talk about it now, or indeed go there now, which I did. We went to Pompeii and had a guide that showed us around. It was really cool. But also, then when I got back, I happened to have Pliny's account, 2 accounts, but I have one, his account of where he was that day, and he was across the bay that day, and he saw that eruption happen. It starts off with him reading a book, and it's all kicking off. And his family are saying, "Come on, we've got to get out of here. Got to get out of here." And he's like, "No, it's fine. I just want to read my book." And eventually, he realizes that no, they're in real trouble here, and he has to escape. And he tries to escape with his family, and there's soot everywhere and ash everywhere, and people are screaming because this eruption, which destroyed Pompeii, of course, has consequences even across the bay where he is. And he gets out of the road just in time, and then some people die, and this is all this sort of thing. So you can read a contemporary account of somebody who was across the way from that. And of course, it's got its own different perspective. So I think that's a very interesting aspect too, is that reading contemporary accounts of people who were there, they may not always have the full picture or all the facts necessarily. They don't have a sort of broader view of what happened. They can't compare other contemporary sources because they're there at the time, which a later historian may be able to do. But there's something to that account as well. It reminds me actually of that scene at the beginning of Batman versus Superman. That Ben Affleck, Henry Cavill movie. The beginning of that, if I remember correctly, there's some Superman's having a big fight in the Superman movie with Henry Cavill, and the way they start that second movie is that it's sort of from Batman's perspective or Bruce Wayne's perspective, and he's seeing the city being just destroyed by these super beings fighting, and they're bashing through buildings, and the buildings are falling, and people are getting crushed by these buildings, and it's devastating this place. Of course, Superman, the hero, is attempting to fight off the bad guys, but in the process of that fight, there's collateral damage, and Bruce Wayne, runs into the smoke, and everyone's running away. He runs towards it because, of course, he's Batman, right? And he runs towards it, and he rescues this little girl from. I don't remember all the details precisely, but I was struck with that, how much it reminded me of Pliny Younger's account of the eruption of Pompeii. And then he finds out Pliny the Elder dies. I think this is right. Then classicists, please forgive me if I'm getting a couple of details wrong. Dies going over there. His uncle, I think, or grandfather or something, uncle, I think, is going over there in boats. He leads, just like Bruce Wayne in that movie, he leads boats over there to try to rescue people. And in doing so, he himself dies, that sort of heroic act of trying to help others. So it's so interesting to read about that. So what was your original question now? Oh, yeah, modern spirituality. Yeah, modern spirituality. Well, yeah, I don't know about that, really. Such a wide topic, I don't really know what to say. So much going on. So many people exploring so many things. The blessing as well as the blessings of the internet, as well as the drawbacks of the internet, and massively available, information and things. So who can say? I don't know if I have a deeper reflection on the grand scheme of spirituality, at least not off the top of my head.
Okay, interesting.
But I'm happy to go more specific if there's something that's actually on your mind. If you're just sort of fishing for something, I don't know that anything comes to mind right away.
So let me ask you, what is healing, perhaps? And I know that that's like a very broad question as well, but what do you think of, using, let's say, your method for healing? What does that look like for an individual?
Yeah, well, I tend to divide activities into, when it comes to a question like that, 2 sort of categories. And maybe we could, to make it easier to describe, we'll return to healing, talk about this idea of embodiment. We could say that there are embodiment activities and there are embodying activities. So an embodiment activity is an activity that its main aim is embodiment, which, as I defined it, was feeling the sensations of the body, right? So some activity designed to connect one to that feeling and cultivate that sort of sensitivity. It may have other secondary benefits, like de-stressing, for example. But let's say the technique is designed to achieve the aim of embodiment. So it's an embodiment technique. Then there are other techniques that have another primary goal, but maybe the secondary or tertiary consequence or benefit is embodiment. So they're embodying techniques, we could say. For example, weight training. The main goal of weight training is not, I don't think, to sort of feel the sensations of the body, right? It's to get stronger, build strength, fitness, etc. Maybe it has an aesthetic goal, right, to build muscles and build a physique, etc. Perhaps a secondary benefit, you might find yourself more in touch with your body. Certainly, there are ways of doing weight training that bring you further away from contact with your body. That, the sort of brutalizing, kind of numbing effect of physical activities, whether it's weight training or yoga, can be like that too. There can be lots of yoga practices. It's very sort of alienating, sometimes philosophically alienating from the body. The body is, in a sense, it's part of Maya, it's part of illusion. It's holding you here in this realm of samsara. It's actually, we need to discipline them. The body has to be overcome and conquered and so on. So there are these sorts of approaches, right? But there are other approaches that are not so anti-body. In any case, physical activity, which has a goal other than embodiment, can still have an embodying effect. So it's good to know that. What is the main goal of the activity you're doing, and what are its possible secondary or tertiary benefits or impacts too? I think it's the same for healing. There are many activities that the main goal is something else, but they can have a healing effect. But they're not designed for healing. So we have to bear that caveat in mind. Some people find weight training and exercise can have a tremendously healing effect. It can build confidence, can de-stress, can give one a sense of agency. I've seen that. Actually, I've seen people who've trained and through transforming themselves through physical training have rediscovered a sense of agency and a sense of kind of power, if you want, personal power, in a really positive way, especially after a crisis. I've seen that. Sometimes people get involved in survival training, woodcrafting training, going out in the woods and learning, stuff like that, or hiking groups and contact with nature, etc. Your hiking group is not explicitly therapeutic. It's not a therapeutic modality per se, but can it have a therapeutic effect? Certainly it can. And I think it's okay that things that aren't explicitly healing tools can have healing effects. And then there are other things that are explicitly designed for healing, right? Whether it's physiotherapy, now we're transitioning to this idea of healing, whether it's physiotherapy, different sorts of therapeutic modalities of various types, right? It's all different kinds. Going to see your therapist, group sessions, whatever. And the goal there is healing. So I think one can take one's remedies wherever one finds them. But if you go into hiking looking to heal yourself, it might work because there can be a healing benefit of connecting with nature and being with other people and walking and getting outside and getting away from your phone and everything like that. Or meditation. It might work. You might heal your trauma through meditation, maybe, because it can be a healing thing, can have healing consequences, but I don't know if it's really designed totally for that. So in a way, you're doing something for a secondary or tertiary benefit. Sometimes that's okay and that's enough. Sometimes it isn't enough, and you need a more direct healing modality, such as therapeutic modalities of various types, or something that's explicitly set up and aiming as its primary benefit a healing, or one of its primary benefits is a healing. People get stuck there. They say, well, don't use meditation for healing, but then there's a problem, because sometimes people feel they get healed in various ways. I'm using that word very broadly, through meditation. So how does that work? Well, because it's a secondary or tertiary benefit. So we can assess activities in that way. And I think that's a useful distinction, at least in my mind.
Yeah. There are a couple of topics that we touched on that I want to get deeper on. And, we talked about the mind-body connection. You mentioned enlightenment in the beginning of this podcast, that you're not looking for enlightenment and healing. And then this concept of spirituality as well, that, I think they tie in all together. And, just kind of as you were describing, a little bit about feeling ourselves within our body and being embodied. It's so interesting. I try to think about this all the time. I feel myself extremely strongly, like right here. Like like this is where I am. Like I'm in my like I'm literally in this space between my face and the world. Like I feel it so strongly. And then the rest of my body, I can feel it and tap into it, but it doesn't feel like me as much as this space right here does. You know what I mean? And I find that so fascinating. I always am curious about if that's other people's experiences as well. But I remember as a child, I used to feel myself very strongly in my entire body. Like this same feeling that I have that seems very limited to my face. Like I think I remember as a kid being able to very much feel myself within my chest and whole body and everything. That's fascinating. I don't know. That might just be like a weird anecdote, but I'm curious to know if you have thoughts on that.
Well, yes, it's actually a very interesting point you make, I think, and very interesting observation. And as I'm sure you know, lots of Enlightenment-oriented traditions tackle this exact issue. This sense of the self per se, but also the sense of the self as any one particular thing, like a particular vantage point. I'm behind my eyes somehow. I'm like up here, right? And I feel the same way a lot of the time because, of course, the eyes are so dominant. This is where the mouth is, right? The ears, right? It's sort of like. Yeah. But a certain tradition suggests that there are two ways that might be. That's a sort of habitual, relative kind of posture that we take to be ultimate or absolute. That there's a suggestion that might be the case in certain traditions or ways of thinking. In other words, that we can confuse what is a habitual posture of identification with who we actually really are. This is me, rather than this is a sort of posture of perception. And then you can go in two ways. You can expand your sense of me, and this is often a consequence of practice rather than a practice in itself. But you expand your sense of me to include more. So rather than just being you up here, you end up feeling an intimacy or kinship in a way, with more of yourself, and a sort of identification with more than that. And then that sense of self or sense of me can expand even beyond the body to where you look around, and sometimes people report this as a mystical experience or as a lived experience, reality that persists. You look around and the floor is me. The ceiling is me. The birds are me. You're me. People say that like a oneness kind of feeling. Yeah. That's one flavor that can come out. And it's not so much that it's all me in the sense that it's no less me than this vantage point that you described so well. There is another way of going, which perhaps amounts to the same sort of thing, just from the other direction, which is a disidentification with that which you take to be you. So rather than an expanding of the sense of oneself, which of course undermines that subject-object distinction, you dissociate from all that which is you. Well, if this body is me, what happens if I lose my arm? Well, it doesn't really affect. I'm still here, so I'm not my arm. What about my leg? What about this? What about that? How much of me could I lose, or could it be changed and I still be me? Was I me when I was younger? Well, none of my cells are the same now. It's changing. So they investigate like this. The dissociation, or the thoughts, maybe the thoughts are me, my opinions, but they change too. And I don't know where they really come from. Sometimes I try to stop my thoughts and they come anyway. And so I don't seem to be in control of those. And so maybe I'm not my thoughts. What about my emotions? Sometimes, when you feel angry, it just feels like you're just totally unified by that anger. It's me, I am angry, or you're feeling happy, everything's great. You feel so unifying about that. But these emotions change and you still remain. You are still there. Who are you? You're not your body, you're not your emotions, not your thoughts. And so there's this sort of dissociation. Sometimes they call it a neti, not this, not that. That's one particular approach, a negative theology sort of approach. They sometimes say, not this, not that. Negative theology is defining God in terms of what he isn't, but maybe that's not so appropriate really, but it's a sort of that idea. So I'm not this, I'm not that. And then you sort of question the very idea of you. as an ultimate reality, a fixed point. So these are two directions that traditions tend to go in. There are other methods too, other means too. For example, means of union, one way or another, that can also recontextualize. So what it amounts to, I think, in the end, is a recontextualization of the sense of the self, a recontextualization where it's not that you eliminate the sense of yourself necessarily, but it's recontextualized from being the ultimate limited fixed point of reference to being a center among centers. Sometimes I think of it like the solar system. People used to think in the old days that the Earth was the center of the universe, right? People used to think that. And then we moved to this heliocentric view, right? That the sun is the center and we orbit around the sun. That was a big deal for some people because suddenly they felt very decentered from the whole thing. But it's not true that the Earth is not the center. It is the center. And we have our own things that orbit the Earth, right? Like Moon and Starlink satellites and stuff, right? So it is a center. It's just a center among centers. There's a recontextualization there. And it's the same thing can happen on the individual sense of the self. One thinks sometimes that insight into the self, which is so valorized in many of these meditation traditions, involves an elimination of the self. And maybe in some ideas it is like that, but it can also be a recontextualization of the self, a flexibility of self-identification. So anyway, those are some musings, if you like, on the self.
Yeah, no, I like those thoughts of like either expanding or kind of understanding that the I is perhaps beyond. I don't know if it's how we're raised or just what our natural intuition is about what the I is. Yeah, it's a very fascinating topic. Obviously, it's gotten philosophers thinking for a very long time, but
Yes.
yeah, I tend to think at this point in my life that I am what experiences, and obviously there's like many levels to that. So like in a sense, when I believe that I will continue beyond this body, I believe that if there is anything that will continue to experience beyond this, that is like my consciousness. So like my conscious awareness perhaps will continue to experience, and it's like I like the thought of you mentioned like I'm not my thoughts or my emotions or all that stuff, and you might appreciate this because I think it's a I was I think I saw it on Instagram or something. It's a Viking saying that if somebody is sad, they say sadness is upon me, or like whatever emotion you say that emotion is upon me, instead of like how we kind of identify like, oh, I'm sad, I'm depressed or something. Like you would say that emotion is like it's something that you're experiencing as opposed to it being within and internal. And I think that's so powerful because I think at the same time when we experience physical pain or something like that, we can externalize it very easily. We can say it's like, oh, somebody just hit me. It's not like you're hurting yourself from within. It's there's nothing inherently wrong with you. Because I feel like sometimes when we might say, oh, I'm so mad, that it almost is like a something's wrong with us. But there's nothing wrong. We're experiencing something. It's on us, and that's okay to experience.
I should also perhaps mention that there are, seeing as we're thinking about the self and the sense of the self and the ways in which it is modified by religious practices of various types, particularly meditation practices, or non near-death experiences can happen. All kind of things can change that. Some people do report a sense of not having a self, a sense of a sort of non-local field of awareness that doesn't have a center point. So it's not merely then a recontextualizing of a sense of the self, which remains, albeit in a different frame, or maybe not as oneself ultimately. But some people that do report a kind of unraveling of that sort of not,
Mm.
that subjective uh, vantage point into a kind of field of awareness, non-local kind of thing, and that the personality sort of manifests within that field. And often those sorts of people also report, at least on a certain level, the sense of lack of agency or
Mm.
spontaneity. So, and sometimes those experiences are temporary to a mystical experience that one has in meditation, or, near-death experience, or I suppose some people have that sort of thing from psychedelics,
Yeah.
Uh, and things like that, and other various other things that you can have like that, high stress situations, or sometimes it just happens. Some people it just happens then, and so sometimes it sort of stays like that. Other times it's a window that opens and then closes again.
Hmm.
And
Yes.
other times still it becomes a point that people fix onto the new state.
Hmm.
In other words, it's like, I thought I was like this, but now I realize I'm like this.
Yeah.
And they make the same mistake as before, rather than they've changed prison cells. Previously, they had a fixed sense of identification that they realized now, it was limited and so on. And now they identify with this new state, and now they're in a sense in the same setup again. They're in a different prison cell, except this one's got prayer flags and some incense and a singing bowl, something like that. So anyway, this is very interesting. Like you said, philosophers have thought about it a lot. Mystics have practiced it a lot. I can really speculate about these rarefied Enlightenment realms. They're a little bit above my pay grade, Gabby.
Yeah, but that actually leads me to ask you, like, what do you think enlightenment is? Obviously, I think what you've just described is that there are layers to it. It's not just like enlightenment or not. It's, it seems to be gradients, and that's typically how I think. But, you mentioned you're not chasing after enlightenment or anything like that. So I guess, can you speak on what it is that you're not chasing?
Yeah. Well, what is enlightenment is a great question. And I know, and I'm sure you know, that enlightenment is conceived of in different terms, in different religious traditions, and in different movements within different religious traditions at different times. So, what is enlightenment? We could say that there are many answers to that question, depending on which traditions we reference. And I don't mean that to sidestep the question. I just mean to say that there are many different kinds of enlightenments out there, right? And maybe if I was really enlightened, I'd be able to tell you which one's the right one. Some people see it as they're all different facets of the same diamond, right? Maybe some of them are bunk, but there's a lot of them that are they're different facets of the diamond of enlightenment, different faces of it. Other people will say, no, mine was the right one, and these are all incomplete, or they have some sort of a drawback, some sort of fly in the ointment. So there's these different ideas, right? And I'm, I don't think as people, as human, as a human race or whatever, we've figured out the answer, at least not sufficiently well enough to convince everybody, whatever it might be. And I'm not, unfortunately, myself experientially enlightened enough to be able to, or at all, to be able to arbitrate those sorts of various claims. But I can tell you a fun story that's a good way of getting out of this question. So I don't mean to get out. I've answered the question as best as I can, which is I don't know. I don't know the answer, Gabby. What is enlightenment? I know there's a lot of different answers to it, but I don't know what the right one is. Here's a sort of an anecdote that's quite a fun way of answering that question. One of my main meditation teachers is Shinzen Young, American meditation teacher, very, very amazing guy. In his late 70s now, I believe. And he was in Japan. He's very competent in several Asian languages, one of them being Japanese. His Japanese is very good indeed. And he was living in Japan for a period of time, and he was training in meditation there. And he went on a TV show, some sort of talk show in Japan, and he was there, and the head monk was there, and the abbot was there, the Zen sort of Roshi, the spiritual master of their institution. And the talk show host said to them, looked at Shinzen and said, so, Shinzen, at the end of the day, when we really get down to it, what is enlightenment anyway? And so Shinzen looked at the head monk. And the head monk looked at the Roshi. They passed it up the line, And now the Roshi has to answer. And this kind of a pithy statement to a question like that, it's sort of one of the specialties of Zen, right? So it's also the sort of thing that if you don't come up with a good answer as a Roshi, right, sort of you'll never live it down, I guess. So what did he say? He said, well, I guess you could say enlightenment is the passing away of the distinction between enlightened and not enlightened. That was his answer.
That reminds me of what you mentioned earlier, the Conan kind of riddles. It's something to think about and reflect on. What does that mean when it passes away? And I think what jumped to me is it's just what is. Like we tend to label things and whatever. It's like, oh, this is just reality, being at peace with it. And I don't know, that's just what came to mind. But it's just one of those, like you said, it's one of those Zenisms.
Yeah. And it's, I think, quite clever, perhaps quite profound.
Yeah.
But maybe one of the greatest virtues of that anecdote is that it's quite concise.
Yeah. So would you be open to maybe talking about some of your experiences that you would consider spiritual?
Sure, we could. Oh, please say more, Gabby.
I think there is a lot of spiritual experiences that one could have, and I'm curious to hear if you have any that you would like to share.
Well, sure. Spiritual experiences, of course, hard to define exactly what that is, but special or meaningful experiences of some type, which I think for the sake of time we would have to leave off defining too precisely. I've noticed two types, and I don't know if there are really two types. I'm sort of I'm freewheeling this answer, right?
Yeah.
One of them is the sudden type, and the other is the gradual type.
Mm.
There's the epiphany or the aha, and then there's the sort of dawning realization that sort of creeps up on you. And of the sudden epiphany type, anything I've ever had like that's always come by accident. I know there are some people who I interview them all the time on my Guru Viking podcast. So I know that there are people who do their meditations and they're able, through the power of their meditation, their skill and momentum of their practice, attain certain states, break through reproducibly into certain sort of altered states or special states of some type, spiritual states, right? Spiritual experience of various types. But I've never really been able to do that as far as I can remember. So it's the time, it's sort of accidental. So I can say that. And as for the growing or gradual creeping up on you sort of thing, one thing I've noticed is a kind of meeting of heaven and earth. And what I mean by that, I have to unfortunately speak in bad poetry here. There can be a sense of the sacred becoming ordinary and the ordinary becoming sacred, but not in a way that debases the sacred, nor in a way that makes the ordinary somehow other than ordinary. A kind of sacred ordinariness, you could say, where the touch of heaven, the taste of heaven, is in the experience of the ordinary. Amidst it, maybe intrinsic to it, maybe inseparable from it. A kind of meeting of heaven and earth in that sense. So that's something that I've noticed creeps up a little bit. You start to look at the walls and this is again metaphorical, or poetic in a way. They sort of glow or shine in a way. And those sorts of rarefied accidental states become integrated and therefore ordinary. They don't lose their sacred quality, not all the way, but they do sometimes lose their surprising aspect. Often I think when one has sudden experiences, they can have a surprising aspect to them, a shock. Wow. Yeah. And sometimes that shocking aspect is confused with the sacred aspect. And I don't think that those two are necessarily the case. It's possible for something to remain profoundly sacred, but to also become very intimate. maybe that's even a better word than integrated, to become very intimate. So it still has that awesome quality, that beauty, that transcendent quality, but it's not always a shock.
Hmm.
It's a little bit like a romantic relationship. That shock, that excitement of, there's different types of intimacy, right?
Right.
But nonetheless, it remains somehow sacred. So that's a very meandering, I'm afraid, and poetic, poorly poetic, metaphorical answer to your question. Sacred ordinariness would be my answer to you. Sacred ordinariness.
Yeah, no, I thought that's beautiful actually, and it very much resonates with me. But before I ask you the final question, first of all, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Steve. This has been a fascinating conversation. And, maybe do you want to shout out where people can find you and, if they want to get to know more about you, where they can go?
Sure. Thank you. It's been a very nice conversation, Gabby. Thank you for inviting me and your thoughtful questions and discussion. GuruViking.com is the website, GuruViking.com, or you can search YouTube for Guru Viking, or Spotify or podcast apps and stuff, or Instagram, GuruViking.com.
Okay, awesome. If there was something that you can yell from the rooftops that if like you wanted everyone to know, what would you want? What would you want them to know?
Yeah. You remember I said before about this idea of inquiry-based approach?
Yeah.
I think someone who really knows something knows the value of knowing it for yourself, finding it out for yourself, in a sense. And of course, a teacher can help you do that. But fundamentally, the learning has to occur on the side of the pupil or the student. And that way you have a first-hand experiential understanding rather than merely a second-hand experiential understanding. And I think especially when it comes to meditations and religious stuff, oftentimes there's, in fact, the traditions themselves talk about this, different ways of knowing things. A second-hand heard knowing, intellectual understanding, and then there's an experiential understanding, right? Sometimes they have that idea. In fact, the Tibetan word that's often translated as meditation, gom, means to familiarize or habituate. It also means meditation, but in the sense of its connotation is habituating or familiarizing oneself to something. So it carries that connotation of bringing something into your own experience. So that's why I favor this sort of inquiry over imposition approach, setting up learning situations rather than dictating from a rooftop or otherwise some universal message. So I think I would, if I was on a rooftop with a megaphone, I don't know that I'd say anything at all.
I think that's a very profound answer, non-answer. I love that.
It's certainly a non-answer, yeah. Whether
Yeah.
it's profound is I think you're being generous there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the idea of taking an experience to be able to learn from it instead of just being preached at, I think it's a very valuable concept.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if someone put a gun to my head, I'd probably say something like "God is love," something trite like that. So, well, that's actually that's more profound, really, isn't it? God is
God
love,
is love, yeah.
or something like that. I don't know if someone put a gun to my head and I had to say something, I'd probably say something like that.
All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Steve James. Be sure to go send him some love over at Guru Viking. He is such a cool dude, and I enjoyed having this conversation about enlightenment, spirituality, growth, and the journey. Guys, be sure that you are commenting. What was your favorite part of this episode? I'm very curious to hear from you and what you got out of it. At the same time, be sure that you like this video, share it with people, subscribe, follow, leave a 5-star glowing review. Guys, this does so much to help the podcast, and I'm so grateful to all of you for listening. So thank you so much. Very grateful again. Aside from that, next episode is going to be with Kevin Palmieri. We talked about business and starting a podcast and his personal growth journey and all that. So it was a fun episode, and I'm very excited to put it out. But just to take this time to talk a little bit about what I've been up to and go on a bit of a rant, about the 25th episode, because that's really exciting. And I hope to make a dedicated video just talking about making 25 episodes of the podcast and what that's like. Just first of all, I've been building out this studio here, and I'm very excited to have guests that are, going to be in person. The podcast will be in person once again, and I'm excited for that. It's a beautiful studio, and I can't wait to show it off once it's finished. I'll probably post it in that 25 episode video that I'm going to make. But I've been reflecting on this podcast recently, and just to understand that, I think one of the main things about a podcast is thought leadership, right? It's kind of about what the host thinks. People want to hear about the host and their style, what they believe. I realize that I probably speak about 25% of the time in my podcast, if that even. Part of that is totally intentional, and it has a lot of great things that it does for me. For example, I really get to understand my host and hear what they're saying and have this fascinating conversation, and I love doing that. I love hearing other people's perspectives and learning from them. And one of the benefits that it has is that many of the guests that I've had on my podcast have told me that I am the best podcast that they've been on, which is really flattering. But the downside is that people don't really understand what I'm about. The reason that I would say that it's intentional is because I feel like in our culture, there is so much emphasis on speaking and not really listening. Everything is kind of a debate and a trigger and a this and a that, whatever. It's like, can you really sit down and understand another person's perspective? For example, sitting with Steve James. Steve and I have wildly different beliefs in this episode, right? But I was mesmerized and fascinated to hear about him and his perspective and what he's learned. But at the same time, we do have the similarities in that we're both curious and we're open and we want to learn and we want to grow, which is such an incredible and beautiful thing. It could so easily turn into something else if not for the willingness on both of our ends, to sit down and listen to each other and have a conversation. So it's something that I believe in, and it's something that I would like to emulate and see more in the culture and in the society. And I think that that would just be healthier. At the same time, I think that makes this podcast a less sexy podcast, because I personally love listening to a podcast where people are debating. I kind of like it when things devolve. Like I listen to Piers Morgan or something, and there's something that it's almost like a guilty pleasure where I get some type of interesting feeling about how, how like things just devolve and whatnot. But yeah, in the future, I do hope to bring more guests here and have more collaborative conversations with people, and also put more of my voice and thoughts out there. It's still a process that I'm navigating. You would think that, hey, you put 25 episodes out, you should be pretty professional at this. I am still figuring it out. I still feel 25 episodes in that I don't know much more about podcasting and what I should do, and about feeling confident and comfortable in sharing my voice. I don't feel any more comfortable and confident in that than I did in my first episode. Part of that might just be like, okay, go get a coach or go learn something. You're not learning enough on growing your podcast and figuring out what you need to do. But the truth is that 25 episodes is still so small. You can't do something 25 times and expect to be good at it. Like, yeah, I'm probably more confident and able to speak out on what I think than your average person, because I've actually done this and put my money where my mouth is in that sense. But it's still difficult, and it's still annoying. I edit all my own episodes, and I hear the sound of my own voice, and I hear how many times I say and like and this and that, and I just want to cut it all out. But it's a growing process, it's a learning process, and I'm excited, and I think I will get somewhere one day, which is the main goal. Anyways, guys, I love you. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, you are more capable than you think you are. Stay curious, think for yourself, and to the rebellion.